A billionaire haunted by the past visits his son's grave as he does every Sunday. But this time something is different. A mysterious homeless girl appears, watching him from afar, her piercing green eyes filled with secrets. When she vanishes into the shadows, she leaves behind something impossible, something that shakes him to his core. Who is she? And what truth is she hiding? Get ready for a story filled with mystery, emotion, and unexpected revelations. What she reveals will leave you speechless. This is another you truly feel the emotions of stories that make you reflect on life. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Theodore Lancaster knelt before his son's grave, the rough surface of the tombstone cold beneath his palm. Every Sunday, for the past 12 years, he had followed the same routine, bringing a small bouquet of white carnations, Benjamin's favorite flowers. It was an unspoken ritual, a way to keep his son's memory alive. As he arranged the delicate petals against the dark granite, his fingers trembled slightly. It had been so long, and yet the pain had never dulled. The silence of the cemetery wrapped around him like an old, familiar coat, offering a strange sort of comfort. Then something changed. A movement in the distance. Near the gnarled oak tree at the edge of the lot, a girl stood watching him. Her dark skin contrasted with her piercing green eyes, which shimmered in the fading sunlight. "Hello?" Theodore called, rising to his feet, his voice calm but firm. The girl did not respond. She merely tilted her head, her expression unreadable, then turned and slipped into the trees. His brow furrowed. It was not often that strangers visited this secluded part of the cemetery, especially not young girls who seemed to appear and disappear like wraiths. He took a hesitant step forward, his instincts battling logic. Perhaps she was simply a lost visitor, a grieving child searching for a loved one. But something about the way she had looked at him unsettled him, as if she had been studying him rather than merely watching. Exhaling, he shook his head. Maybe he was allowing grief to make him see things that weren't there. Turning back toward the grave, he prepared to say his final words to Benjamin for the day. But the sight before him sent his heart into a frenzied rhythm. Lying atop the bouquet of white carnations was a single white lily. Theodore staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes darted across the cemetery, scanning the empty paths, the rows of silent gravestones. There was no sign of the girl, no movement among the trees. His stomach clenched. It was impossible. No one had been close enough to place the flower there without him noticing. And yet, there it was, a white lily, the same flower Claire used to bring for Benjamin. Claire, his beloved wife, gone for 5 years now. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. A coincidence? A cruel trick played by some stranger who knew too much? Or was it something else entirely? He bent down, hesitating before reaching out. The petals were soft beneath his fingertips, dewy as if freshly picked. His pulse thundered in his ears. Was this a message? But from whom? And why now? He straightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He was not a man easily shaken. His life had been built on control, on calculated risks, on making sense of chaos. But this was different. The cemetery was a place of the past, of memories long buried, not a place for mysteries to unfold in real time. A chill prickled the back of his neck, and he forced himself to turn away from the grave, pushing aside the unease creeping through him. Perhaps he would return tomorrow, make inquiries, see if the groundskeeper had noticed anything unusual. He had to be logical, but as he stepped toward the main path, the whisper of rustling leaves made him pause. His gaze flicked back to the oak tree. Nothing, just the steady stillness of the cemetery. And yet he could not shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden among the shadows, someone was still watching. Theodore's footsteps were firm as he made his way through the cemetery, his pulse steady, but his mind restless. For the past week, the image of the girl had haunted him, those piercing green eyes, the way she had studied him as if she knew something he didn't. He wasn't a man prone to obsession, but this was different. Something about her unsettled him, as if she were a loose thread unraveling a truth he had long since buried. Arriving earlier than usual, he scanned the area, his eyes settling on the same gnarled oak tree where he had seen her before. And there she was, kneeling before Benjamin's grave, her small frame hunched beneath a threadbare coat. She murmured something he couldn't make out. It was not the posture of a stranger paying brief respects. It was intimate, personal. She belonged there in a way that made his stomach tighten. He stepped forward, careful not to startle her. "Did you know Benjamin?" His voice was measured, but the weight of his curiosity pressed through. The girl lifted her head slowly, her gaze locking onto his with a calm that unnerved him. There was no fear, no surprise, only something that felt deliberate, like she had been expecting him. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice steady, firm. Theodore's brows knitted together, the automatic response of a man who was used to people assuming he was there to offer charity. "I'm not offering money," he countered, keeping his tone even. "I just want to understand." A flicker of hesitation passed over her face, but it was brief. With a quiet exhale, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn medal. Her fingers curled around it protectively for a moment before she extended it toward him. Theodore took it, his hands steady but his heartbeat accelerating. He flicked it open with the ease of someone used to handling things of value, but nothing could have prepared him for what was inside. The photograph inside the locket was old, the edges slightly curled from time. On one side was Benjamin, his bright, boyish smile, exactly as Theodore remembered. But beside him was a woman he had never seen before, dark-haired, with soft features and eyes that held an unmistakable sadness. His chest tightened as he searched his memory, but nothing surfaced. "Who is she?" His voice was low, controlled, but the demand in it was unmistakable. The girl's lips pressed into a firm line. For a moment, she looked like she wasn't going to answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "My mother." Theodore's grip on the locket tightened. The weight of her words settled over him like a cold fog. This wasn't just some lost girl. She had a reason for being here, a reason that had everything to do with Benjamin, and perhaps a reason that could change everything he thought he knew. Back at his mansion, Theodore sat in his study, the small locket resting in the palm of his hand. The woman in the photograph had a soft smile, her long, curly hair cascading over her shoulders. There was something familiar about her, something unsettling. He turned the locket over between his fingers, as if the simple motion would somehow conjure an answer. How had she known Benjamin? Why had this girl, Evelyn, been carrying a picture of his son alongside her mother's? He had spent years believing he knew everything about Benjamin's life, every friend, every struggle, but this was a connection he had never even suspected. His jaw clenched as he exhaled, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't something he could let go. He needed answers. The next morning, he placed a call to Richard Hayes, a private investigator he had used before. Richard had a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and most importantly, relentless. If there were answers to be found, he would find them. When Richard arrived at the mansion, Theodore wasted no time, handing over the locket and pointing to the woman in the photograph. "I need to know who she is, and how she was connected to my son," Theodore said, his voice unwavering. Richard examined the image closely, his brow furrowing. "This might take some time," he admitted, turning the locket over as if hoping for a hidden inscription or a clue. "But I'll find out." Theodore gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. I don't care how long it takes. Just bring me the truth." That evening, Evelyn sat at the long dining table in Theodore's home, her posture tense, her hands resting awkwardly in her lap. She had been hesitant to accept his invitation to dinner, but after some coaxing, she had relented. Now, as they sat, across from each other, the clinking of silverware was the only sound filling the space. Theodore observed her carefully, noting the way she seemed both guarded and defiant, as if she expected him to challenge her presence at any moment. He had learned her name, Evelyn, but that was just a start. He needed more. Taking a sip of his wine, he finally spoke. "Who was your father?" Evelyn's fingers curled slightly around her fork, and for the first time that evening, she hesitated. Her eyes darted downward, then back up, locking onto his with quiet intensity. "Benjamin Lancaster," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the air between them shift. Theodore's grip on his utensils faltered, and the fork in his hand slipped, clattering against the plate. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. His mind, however, was anything but calm. His son, her father. His hands slowly lowered to the table, his breathing measured as he processed what she had just said. "You're telling me." He paused, as if needing to taste the words before he spoke them aloud. "That Benjamin was your father?" Evelyn nodded once, not looking away. Theodore leaned, back in his chair, his pulse hammering. This revelation changed everything. "Theodore, we need to talk." Richard Hayes stood in the doorway of the study, his expression grave, holding a thin folder in one hand. Theodore, seated behind his massive mahogany desk, barely lifted his gaze from the locket still resting on the polished wood. It had been days since Evelyn's revelation, and yet his mind refused to fully accept it. A granddaughter, Benjamin's child. How had he never known? He felt as though the foundation of his world had shifted, leaving him unsteady, uncertain. He motioned for Richard to enter, bracing himself for whatever truth the investigator had. Uncovered, Richard stepped forward and placed the folder in front of him. "I have answers," he said, "but I don't think you're going to like them." Theodore swallowed hard before flipping the folder open. The first document was an old missing persons report. A photograph of the woman from the locket was clipped to the top, her name printed in bold beneath it. "Helena Foster." "That's her," Theodore murmured, running a finger over the image. His mind searched through fragments of memory, but the name didn't spark recognition. "Who was she?" Richard crossed his arms. "She disappeared 11 years ago. No witnesses, no leads. Just vanished. The police eventually archived the case." He hesitated before adding, "She was listed as a single mother. No mention of the father of her child." Theodore felt his pulse quicken. "And Evelyn?" Richard exhaled sharply. "After her mother disappeared, she was taken in by neighbors. Foster care wasn't involved. Looks like she slipped through the cracks. She stayed with different families, none of them permanent. When she got older, she started running. She's been living in shelters, on the streets." His voice lowered. "She's had a hard life." Theodore. A wave of guilt crashed over him, tightening his throat. Benjamin had a daughter, his granddaughter, and she had spent her life struggling to survive, while he had lived in his mansion, unaware of her existence. How many nights had she spent cold and hungry while he sat in comfort? He clenched his fists, furious with himself, with fate, with Benjamin for never telling him the truth. "Why didn't he say anything?" Theodore whispered, more to himself than to Richard. "Why did Benjamin keep this from me?" Richard didn't answer immediately, giving Theodore a moment to process the weight of it all. Then, cautiously, he asked, "What are you going to do now?" Theodore straightened in his chair. His mind was still reeling, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this. Evelyn had been alone for too long. He wasn't sure how to fix the past, but he could at least change the future. "I want more answers," he said firmly. "There has to be more to this. I want to know everything about Helena Foster, who she was, what happened to her, and why she disappeared. And I want to know why Benjamin never told me about Evelyn." Richard gave a small nod. "I'll keep digging. But, Theodore, Evelyn's here now. Maybe you should focus on what's in front of you first." Theodore sat in silence after Richard left, staring at the locket once more. Helena Foster, Benjamin's secret, and Evelyn, the granddaughter he never knew he had. There were too many questions, too many gaps in the story. But one thing was certain, he had already lost his son. He wouldn't lose his granddaughter, too. As Theodore stepped through the grand entrance of his mansion that evening, something immediately caught his eye. Lying on the pristine rug just inside the door was a single white lily. His breath hitched as he stared at it, his mind racing. It was too deliberate to be a coincidence. He bent down, slowly picking up the delicate flower, his fingers tightening around its stem as unease crept over him, a white lily, just like the one that had appeared on Benjamin's grave. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. Richard arrived minutes later, summoned urgently by Theodore's terse phone call. As soon as the investigator stepped inside and saw the flower in Theodore's hand, his jaw tightened. "Someone is watching you," he said without hesitation, his voice sharp, analytical. He took the flower from Theodore, examining it as though it might yield a hidden clue. "This isn't just intimidation. It's a warning." Theodore's fingers curled into fists, his mind churning through possibilities. Who would go to such lengths? Who had something to lose from the truth being uncovered? Before either man could say more, a hurried knocking on the door broke the tense silence. When Theodore opened it, Evelyn stood there, her expression unreadable, but her hands shook as she held out her phone. "I got this," she said, her voice tight. Theodore took the phone from her, his eyes scanning the message on the screen. The words sent a bolt of rage through him. "Stop digging into the past, or you'll end up like your mother." Theodore exhaled sharply, gripping the device as his knuckles whitened. He lifted his gaze to Evelyn, who was staring at him with a look that was equal parts defiance and fear. "This means she was murdered, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. Theodore clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. The weight of the message settled in his chest like lead. It wasn't just a warning. It was confirmation. Evelyn's mother hadn't just disappeared. She had been silenced. Richard stepped closer, scanning the screen with a grim expression. "They're trying to scare you off. That means we're close to something." He handed the phone back to Evelyn, but Theodore could see the calculation in his eyes. The investigator wasn't just concerned. He was analyzing, already plotting the next step. Theodore turned back to Evelyn, his expression firm. "We're not backing down," he said. "Whoever sent this wants to bury the truth. That means it's time we start digging even deeper." Evelyn swallowed, nodding slightly. There was fear in her eyes, but also something else. Determination. She had spent her whole life searching for answers. She wasn't about to stop now. Richard nodded approvingly. "Then we move fast. I'll track the source of this message, but you need to be careful. If they're watching, they're waiting for a mistake." He glanced toward the white lily, still lying on the table. "And they're willing to do more than just scare you." Theodore's jaw tightened as he stared at the flower, its pale petals deceptively innocent. This was no longer just about the past. It was about survival. "Theodore, you're going to want to see this." Richard Hayes stood by the desk in Theodore's study, a thick folder clutched in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but Theodore knew the investigator well enough to recognize when he was about to drop something heavy. Setting his glass down, Theodore walked over and took the folder, flipping it open. The first page contained a photograph of Helena Foster, the woman from the locket. Below it, her employment records. His stomach twisted as he scanned the lines. She had worked for Lancaster Corp. He lifted his gaze to Richard, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "She worked for me?" Richard nodded. "She wasn't just any employee. She was in research and development, had access to high-level security files. A few months before she vanished, she was looking into restricted documents, stuff she had no clearance for. She was smart about it, careful, but someone flagged her searches. It didn't go anywhere at the time, but now..." He hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "Now it's clear she was looking for something specific." Theodore felt the weight of the words settling into his bones. "What was she trying to find?" he murmured. Flipping through the documents, his hands tightening as he read. Helena Foster had been accessing internal reports, financial statements, and an accident report, one that sent a jolt of ice through Theodore's veins. He swallowed hard as he read the date, the night of Benjamin's death, his eyes flicked back up to Richard, his voice eerily steady. "She was investigating my son's death." Richard exhaled slowly, leaning against the desk. It wasn't just a casual curiosity. She spent weeks digging into it, cross-referencing employee logs, facility security footage, medical reports, and then she disappeared. Theodore's pulse pounded in his ears. For 12 years, he had lived with the pain of Benjamin's death, accepting what he had been told. An accident, a tragedy, but Helena had suspected something different. And if she had been silenced for it, he clenched his jaw. "You think it wasn't an accident?" Richard met his gaze, his expression grim. "I think she found something that suggested otherwise, and I think someone made sure she never got the chance to talk." Theodore paced, the implications unraveling before him like a thread pulled too far. He had buried himself in work after Benjamin's passing, forcing himself to move forward, never questioning the official report. But now, every detail he had once accepted seemed fragile, breakable under the weight of doubt. Had he been blind? Had he ignored signs that something was wrong? Who else knew about her? "Investigation?" he asked, his voice low. Richard shook his head. "That's the problem. She was careful. No close colleagues, no clear digital trail. It's like she knew she was being watched." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Whoever sent that message to Evelyn, they're not just trying to scare her. They're warning her to stop because whatever Helena found is still a threat." Theodore exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Everything was shifting beneath him. The flower left at his door, the message sent to Evelyn, Helena's sudden disappearance. It all pointed to something larger, something buried for over a decade. And if someone had gone this far to keep it hidden, then whatever truth lay beneath was dangerous. "I need more," he said finally. "Find out who had access to those files, who was working that night, who had the most to lose." Richard nodded. "I'll keep digging. I'll keep." Theodore closed the folder, his fingers pressing against the cover as if trying to hold back the flood of possibilities rushing through his mind. He had lost his son once. He wouldn't lose the truth now. Gregory Vance hesitated before opening the door, his face pale and drawn, as if he had seen a ghost. His fingers tightened on the edge of the doorframe, his gaze darting between Theodore and Richard with a nervous energy that only confirmed what they already suspected. He had something to hide. His posture was stiff, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though expecting a blow to land at any moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin, cracking under the weight of tension. "I don't know anything," he said quickly, his words rushing together as if saying them fast enough would make them true. Theodore stepped forward, his sharp gaze never leaving Gregory's face. He had spent decades reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were holding something back. Right now, he saw fear, not just the fear of being caught, but something deeper, fear of consequences, fear of someone else. "You withdrew $500,000 just before Helena disappeared," Theodore stated, his voice calm, deliberate. He didn't ask. He knew. Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, as he visibly struggled to maintain control. "That money wasn't yours," Theodore continued. "Who gave it to you? And what were you supposed to do with it?" Gregory's fingers twitched, his eyes shifting toward the dimly lit hallway behind him, as if considering slamming the door in their faces. But then his resolve broke. He exhaled shakily and stepped back, opening the door wider in silent invitation. Richard shot Theodore a knowing glance before following him inside. The living room was small, cluttered, the kind of place that belonged to a man who never expected guests. Empty liquor bottles sat on the coffee table, a stack of unpaid bills teetering precariously beside them. Gregory ran a hand over his face, sitting heavily on the worn-out couch, his head hanging low. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. Theodore remained standing, arms crossed, his stare unwavering. "Didn't have a choice? You took the money, didn't you?" Gregory let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't understand. They threatened me, told me if I didn't do what they said, I'd disappear too, just like her. Richard leaned forward. Who? He pressed. Who gave you the money, Gregory? The former employee hesitated, his breathing shallow. He wiped a sweaty palm against his jeans before speaking. The board, the company's board of directors. His voice was barely above a whisper, like saying it too loud would summon something dark and unstoppable. Theodore's stomach twisted. He had always known his company was filled with ambitious, ruthless men, but this was something else entirely. They told me to make sure Helena never talked, Gregory admitted. She was getting too close, asking too many questions, about Benjamin, about what really happened the night he died. Theodore's grip on the back of the chair tightened. His heart pounded, but his face remained expressionless. So you silenced her? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. Gregory's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. No, I didn't. I swear I didn't hurt her. I just arranged for her to leave town. They wanted her gone, and I did what I had to do. But I swear I didn't kill her. Richard exchanged a look, with Theodore, his expression unreadable. Then where is she? He asked. Gregory's lips trembled. I don't know, he admitted, shaking his head. I never saw her again after that night. Theodore stepped closer, his towering presence making Gregory shrink into the couch. You're lying. I'm not, Gregory insisted, desperation lacing his voice. I don't know where she is, but if she's alive, she's still in danger. And now that you're digging into this, so are you. Theodore's grip on the steering wheel was firm as he drove back home, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. The board of directors, the men he had trusted, men he had built his empire alongside, could have been responsible for not only Helena's disappearance, but Benjamin's death. It was unfathomable. And yet every piece of evidence pointed in that direction. He had spent years believing his son's death was a tragic accident, something he had no control over. But now he saw the truth lurking beneath the surface. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep secrets buried, and Helena had gotten too close. Now he and Evelyn were doing the same. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped around herself, her green eyes flickering with uncertainty. She had been strong until now, but this revelation had shaken her. She had spent her life searching for answers about her mother, only to uncover something far more dangerous than she had ever expected. Her voice was small when she finally spoke. Does this mean they're going to come after us? Theodore kept his gaze on the road, his jaw tightening. He had spent his entire life negotiating with powerful men, navigating corporate battles with precision and ruthlessness. But this wasn't business. This was life and death. And this time, it was personal. I won't let that happen, he said, his voice firm, absolute. They won't touch you. She looked at him then, doubt flickering in her expression. How can you be so sure? He glanced at her, the weight of his promise settling in. Because they've already taken too much from me. When they arrived at the mansion, something was wrong. The driveway was too still, the front door slightly ajar. Theodore's stomach twisted. He stepped out of the car swiftly, motioning for Evelyn to stay behind him. His instincts were sharp, trained by years of dealing with threats in the corporate world. But this was different. This wasn't a financial dispute or a boardroom betrayal. This was a warning. He pushed the door open wider, stepping inside cautiously. The house was quiet, eerily so. He moved through the hallway, his pulse steady but alert. As he reached his study, his breath slowed. The room had been torn apart. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers yanked open, books pulled from the shelves. His desk, usually pristine, was covered in disarray. But in the middle of it, sitting ominously on the polished wood, was a single sheet of paper. 3 words. Saia disso agora. His fingers curled around the note, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a break-in. It was a message, a direct threat. Whoever was behind. This wanted him to walk away, to stop digging, to abandon the truth. But they had made a critical mistake. They had shown their hand. Evelyn stepped cautiously into the doorway, her breath hitching as she took in the wreckage. They were here, she whispered. Theodore turned to her, his expression Hard. Yes, he said, and they wanted us to know it. Richard arrived minutes later, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He let out a low whistle as he examined the room. This isn't just intimidation, he muttered. They wanted you to feel vulnerable. Theodore exhaled sharply, crushing the note in his fist. They want fear. They want control. He met Richard's gaze. They won't get either. Richard crossed his arms. Then we need to move fast, because whoever did this, they're not done yet. Richard leaned over the table, his fingers tapping a stack of documents, as Theodore scanned the name that appeared repeatedly. Raymond Carter. The man had been the head of security at Lancaster Corp during the time of Benjamin's death and Helena's disappearance. His name was all over internal. Reports, security clearances, and classified files that should have never been accessed. It was more than coincidence. It was a pattern. Theodore's grip tightened on the edge of the table, his mind racing through the implications. If Carter had been involved, then this went deeper than he had ever imagined. "We need to find him," Theodore said, his voice sharp. Richard nodded, already flipping through his phone, making calls, tracking the man's last known whereabouts. It didn't take long. Carter had left Lancaster Corp years ago, but he wasn't exactly in hiding. He was still working in security, just for a different type of clientele. Private contracts, high-profile cases, people who didn't want to be found. It took less than a day to locate him at a private club downtown, a place that catered to men who thrived on secrecy. Theodore didn't hesitate. He wanted answers, and he wasn't going to wait for permission. When Theodore and Richard arrived, Carter was sitting in a leather chair, sipping a glass of whiskey, a smirk already forming as he noticed them approaching. He was in his late 50s, a man with a strong build that had barely softened with age, his eyes sharp, though predatory. He didn't look surprised to see them. If anything, he looked amused. Well, he said, setting his drink down with deliberate ease. "If it isn't Lancaster himself." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit. Let's not make a scene." Theodore didn't sit. He stood over the man, arms crossed, his presence commanding. "You worked for me once," Theodore said. "Now your name keeps showing up in places it shouldn't." Carter leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. "You really think you're going to scare me, Theodore?" He chuckled. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Theodore's jaw clenched. He had faced ruthless businessmen, fought off hostile takeovers, and built an empire on sheer will. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was about his son, about Evelyn, about the truth that had been buried for over a decade. "Then enlighten me," Theodore said. "Enlighten me." His voice low, controlled. "Tell me what I'm dealing with." Carter shook his head, his smirk unwavering. "You think this is about Helena? About Benjamin?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "It's so much bigger than that." Richard stepped in then, his voice edged with frustration. "You were head of security. That means you had access to everything. Footage, reports, internal investigations. What really happened to Benjamin?" Carter's smirk faded just slightly, his fingers tightening around his glass. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said. "You're so focused on the past, but you're not seeing what's right in front of you. You don't stop a machine by looking at where it started. You stop it by cutting the power." Theodore took a slow, measured breath. "And where's the power?" Carter smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the question that's going to get you killed." Theodore's fists clenched at his sides, his patience thinning. "If you think that's going to scare me, you don't know me at all." Carter exhaled, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. "I'm trying to warn you." But Theodore didn't need warnings. He needed answers, and he would find them no matter the cost. Theodore stared at the message on his phone, his grip tightening as he read the words over and over again. "You are digging your own grave." It wasn't a warning. It was a direct threat. His jaw clenched as he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. He had anticipated retaliation, but something about this message felt different. It was personal, Whoever was behind it knew that he wouldn't back down, and they wanted him to know that they were watching. He lifted his gaze to Evelyn, who sat across from him at the dining table, her expression carefully guarded. She had grown quieter. Over the past few days, her usual defiant energy now laced with something heavier, fear. He hated seeing it in her. She had already lost too much, and now she was being dragged into a war she never asked to fight. Yet, when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "They're scared," she said simply. "That's why they keep trying to intimidate us." Theodore nodded, tucking the phone into his pocket. "They should be." He stood, walking over to the window, scanning the darkened street outside. He had spent his entire life dealing with power plays, manipulation and threats, but this was different. This wasn't a boardroom full of men in tailored suits arguing over stock percentages. This was something deeper, something darker, and if they thought he would scare easily, they had underestimated him. Richard entered the room without knocking, his face grim, a folder tucked under his arm. Something, he said, dropping the folder onto the table. "Raymond Carter was paid off, that much we know, but I did some digging. He was in charge of internal security the night Benjamin died." Theodore's entire body went rigid, but he said nothing, letting Richard continue. "Security logs show that cameras in certain sections of the building were disabled for exactly 45 minutes that night. And guess who authorized it?" He tapped a name on the report. "Raymond Carter." Evelyn leaned forward, her hands pressing against the table. "They covered it up," she murmured. "They made it look like an accident." Her voice was tight, anger pushing past the fear. Theodore's fists clenched. "Who gave him the order?" Richard shook his head. "That's the missing piece. Carter didn't have the authority to do it alone. He was answering to someone." He hesitated before adding, "And I'm betting that someone is still pulling strings to keep this buried." Theodore inhaled deeply, forcing himself to think. His instinct was to confront Carter again, press him harder, make him talk. But that was what his enemies expected. They wanted him to react blindly, to rush into a move they had already accounted for. No, he needed to be smarter than that. He needed to be a step ahead. "We keep digging," Theodore said finally. "Find out who Carter was reporting to. Follow the money, track the transactions, look at who else was in the building that night." His eyes darkened. "If they want to play this game, we'll show them we know how to win it." Evelyn watched him carefully before nodding. "I'm with you." Richard sighed but nodded as well. "Then let's move fast, because they're watching us, and I don't think they'll stay quiet for long." Theodore glanced back at his phone, at the ominous message still glaring up at him. His enemies thought fear would stop him. They were wrong. He had already lost his son. He wouldn't lose this fight. Not now, not ever. If you enjoyed this mysterious and chilling tale, don't forget to like this video and comment your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what you think about the enigma of the White Lily. Also, make sure to subscribe to Golden Stories for more thrilling narratives and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this video with someone who would love this mystery. Let's unravel these secrets together. See you in the next story.